Back in the summer of 2020, when COVID shutdowns were still in full swing, my wife and I made the strategic decision to take separate jobs at different ends of the country. The reason for this was that she had received an offer for a visiting professorship. It was a 9-month contract, which meant that both the work itself and the attached health insurance would expire in, 9 months. With that in mind, I took a more permanent position with a more permanent salary and benefits out west. She took the cat to Michigan, I took the dog to Reno. And so began a strange and lonely year, filled with solitude and seemingly interminable stretches of free time. Like a lot of people during this era, I turned to hobbies to fill the time. One of these was movies. Not writing about them or reviewing them, just watching them en masse, one after another, sometimes 3 or 4 over the course of a single evening, only taking breaks to walk my dog or have something to eat. As an antidote to the first hobby, which ultimately amounted to sitting around in front of my laptop for hours on end, I picked up photography. I bought an entry-level camera and started walking all over Reno as soon as work ended. From my apartment downtown, I walked north and south, east and west, miles and miles across casino-laden avenues and industrial parks and suburban streets. I drove out to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada and across the border into California and downstate into the desert where wild burrows and hot springs dotted the landscape. I upgraded my camera. I continued to watch movies. Every day, just like that. Hundreds of shots taken, hundreds of more minutes of cinema consumed. Inside, outside, sunshine, snow, high winds, it didn't matter. Both of these hobbies, which were not quite hobbies but lifelines, afforded me an escape from the claustrophobic confines of my small apartment. It's possible to find obvious connections between watching movies and taking photos. After all, one involves consuming images, the other making them. Both suggest a certain concern with aesthetic and narrative. But the place where these hobbies really ended up converging was a physical one: Lake Tahoe.
1, 2, 3. Let me take you to the party. Lake Tahoe, swinging party.
If you've never been before, what's important to know about Lake Tahoe is that it is profoundly, annoyingly gorgeous. Surrounded by dense sugar pine and snow-capped mountains, it is a visual foil to the sun-baked steel and concrete casinos of Reno. At 22 miles long, 12 miles wide, and 501 meters deep, it is the second deepest lake in the United States. The shallows are crystal clear, the deep is a dark cobalt blue. All of it is bitingly cold, even through the summer. I spent a lot of time at Lake Tahoe, sometimes swimming, sometimes hiking or snowshoeing, but always taking photos. I couldn't get enough of it. I drove out there before the sun came up and stayed long after it went down so I could attempt to capture its many iterations of light and darkness. I took photos from the shore and from the water and from on high atop the peaks that surrounded it. And when I wasn't there, when I was back in my little apartment searching for a movie to watch, I started to wonder how the lake had been represented on the big screen. So I searched for movies that had been filmed at Lake Tahoe. I watched The Godfather Part 2, where Michael Corleone is shown at his family compound on the lake's western shore. I watched the 1951 American Tragedy, A Place in the Sun, filmed partially at the historic Dolby Estate, also on the western shore. I watched the 1947 movie Out of the Past, starring Robert Mitchum, in which the traditionally deep blue waters of the lake are rendered in black and white. And I watched a sleepy thriller from 2001 called The Deep End, in which a mother, played by Tilda Swinton, sinks a dead body in a picturesque cove of perfectly placid, crystalline water on the lake's north side.
Once she looks beneath the surface,
What's going on?
It's not what you think.
How do you know what I think?
she doesn't know where it will lead,
I asked you to handle this. You did not.
who it will touch,
If I could make him go away, I would.
Why are you doing this?
or how deep it will go.
I'm not a believer in things like kismet and fate. Rather, I think that things simply happen, and then we make sense of them after the fact. Sometimes that process of sense-making includes imbuing the arbitrary with a touch of the serendipitous, adorning the banal with a flair of good fortune. And maybe I'm guilty of doing that now, but I don't really know how else to explain it. One day in late April, when snow still blocked some of the mountain roads of the Sierra Nevada, I was cruising through the rustic mansion estates around North Lake Tahoe, looking for the exact cove where Tilda Swinton had dumped the body. I had my camera with me and my dog in the back seat. Every so often, I would stop and park and walk around to figure out if I'd found the right place. But all the beauty kind of bled together. It was hard to differentiate one set of sun-dappled boulders from another. I got back in my car, drove around, got lost. Then I arrived in front of a house that happened to be having an estate sale. I didn't need anything in particular, but I was intrigued to see inside a home that I could never in my wildest dreams afford. So that's what I did. I went in. What surprised me most was how outdated the interior was. Some of the walls were covered in wood paneling. The cabinetry looked like it belonged to the Reagan era. It had the feeling of an old ski chalet, though it's worth noting that, through the large picture window at the front of the house, you could still see a sliver of the lake's surface. I glanced passively at furniture that I could neither afford nor transport in the back of my car. There were stacks of china and power tools and an inexplicable number of wall clocks which had been laid out on a long mahogany dining room table. There were crates of old records which I flipped through even though I did not own a record player, a collection of DVDs that included Basketball, Legends of the Fall, and She's the Man. The agent in charge of the sale informed us that the house had primarily served as a vacation rental property for the last decade, which I suppose explained its peculiar collection of objects and eras. There was a large flat-top desk, the kind a draftsman might use to sketch out architectural blueprints. I didn't need it. I didn't have room for it, but I did like it. Next to it were two tall metal filing cabinets, the kind that came up as high as my chest. I pulled on the top drawer of one, and it didn't open, either because it was locked or jammed. I tried the one beneath it, and it slid open easily. Inside, there were rows of folders and files crammed together, each one containing its own tight mess of papers. I thumbed through them casually, not looking for anything specific. Some were hard to make sense of. Most had been typed out with a typewriter, though there were sheaths of messy handwritten script that were difficult to decipher. I tried the bottommost drawer and found there, amidst a similar tangle of folders, a stack of graph paper notebooks. They looked, for a reason I couldn't quite articulate, significant. Their smell, which was distinctly of the past, attracted me. I opened one and flipped through it to see that every page had been filled with the same cramped handwriting, almost entirely in black ink, though there were splotches of blue throughout. Then I landed on an entry that caught my eye. Here's an excerpt of what it said.
Our conversations now revolve exclusively around the way we were. She does not want to talk about him or the war or tangible loss. Rather, she prefers to spend her time in the cinema, if not in the theater itself, then in the moving image of memory, which has itself become inseparable from the fictions on screen. She says that each time she sees it in the theater, her crying fits arrive earlier and earlier. However, she takes issue with my use of the term crying. Crying is for babies, she says. I asked her which word she preferred I use, and she stared thoughtfully at the ceiling for what felt like a long while, as if she might find the word floating above her.
You might be listening to this excerpt from this unexplained journal and wondering what exactly I'm talking about. So let me provide a little context. The Way We Were refers to the 1973 film starring Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford. The she that you hear referenced in the text is a patient in psychotherapy. And the writer of this entry, which is dated April 2, 1975, is the psychotherapist himself, a man named Dr. Richard Marks Badenhop, or as most people seem to call him, Dick. That's right, the Dick Badenhop, of the Badenhop-Fletcher lacrimation scale that you've heard me mention in episodes prior. And this, me at an estate sale, haphazardly scanning one of his journal entries roughly 46 years after it was first written down, is my first encounter with him. This is the point in the story where I come back to concepts of kismet and serendipity, which again, I don't really believe in. But I don't know how else to explain what happened. I had gone out to Lake Tahoe on that particular spring day, looking for the site of a scene from a movie I had only watched because I had become somewhat obsessed with looking at the lake itself, even when I was stuck in my apartment in Reno. I never found the site from the movie, but what I did find was some obscure personal journal in which a therapist and his patient talked about movies. Maybe it's not fate, but it's something. The estate agent, who must have been watching me as I sifted through the documents, told me that if I wanted to purchase the file cabinets, I would also have to purchase the contents inside. They were a package deal. That was fine with me. I asked her if she knew where the documents came from, and she said no. 5 minutes and $20 later, I lugged them out to my car one by one and stuffed them in the back, much to the chagrin of my dog, who had been patiently waiting for me to return. From there, I scrapped the metal cabinets and kept the folders and notebooks, which, when stacked on top of each other, came up to just above my knee. But I didn't do anything with them right away. In fact, I didn't look at them again for a long time. Instead, I shoved them in the back of my closet. Spring turned to summer. My wife moved from Michigan to Reno, and we found a new apartment together. A year passed. I still watched movies. I still took photos. Our dog died. My wife got a job offer in Pennsylvania, so we packed away all of our things. The journals and the notebooks got crammed into a box of miscellaneous possessions and then loaded onto a truck and then driven across the country, where they were then unloaded and stashed away in the attic, where they were largely forgotten for a few years. I don't know what it was that made me finally open up that box again. It probably wasn't one thing. I had dropped photography as a hobby. I once again had more time on my hands. I was a little bored, a little lost. And I had noticed that I was crying at movies relatively often, which felt unusual. It made me wonder, had I always been this way, or was this a new development? Why did certain movies bring me to tears while my wife remained unmoved? What were the particular triggers that caused me to get choked up? I wanted answers, and finding them required searching far and wide, in academic texts on the phenomenology of crying at the cinema, in film theory and criticism, in the box of papers and journals in my attic that I had by chance stumbled upon years before at an estate sale on the shores of Lake Tahoe. But to find those answers, I also needed to look inward, because this project was ultimately about understanding myself better too. And to do that, I had to go back to the beginning, far beyond the reaches of even my own memory, so I could get a sense of my earliest experiences of crying at the movies. Which meant one thing. I had to call my mom.
Like, I think anytime you cried in a movie, you had good cause to cry in a movie because, you had empathy.
Yeah, I had empathy, or I was very scared.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, in Jurassic, the characters are all terrified too. So, and there were kids in Jurassic.
You'll hear some road noise on this call because my mom was in the car when we spoke, which is pretty typical for us. I call her when I leave work. She calls me. We chat on our commutes home. When I asked her about the first time I cried in a movie theater, it was a bit of a loaded question because I had a specific memory of being taken to see Jurassic Park when I was 3 years old. So when you hear me talk about crying out of fear, it's in reference to that.
Yes, and that was a giant mistake on your parents' part. We didn't really know what the movie was going to be like when we bought the tickets. Dad bought the tickets, and we weren't really sure, what to expect. But you saw no, it was real to you. you were terrified and you were crying. And so I picked you up and left with you. And it turns out Dad had to remind me that we were actually there with other people. And so he stayed and watched the movie with them. And not because he wasn't concerned, but he knew that, you were going to be fine. And you were. As soon as we got in the car, you were fine.
I think my response to the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park can basically be boiled down to pure lizard-brained stimuli. Big monsters, big sound, big bad. To put it simply, I was terrified and wanted nothing more than to escape the threat of danger on screen. So I cried, and my mom whisked me away to the safety of the car. Then everything was okay again. But it's worth noting that I wasn't afraid of dinosaurs as a rule. Like a lot of little kids, I was actually fascinated by them. In fact, one of my favorite childhood movies was entirely about dinosaurs, albeit a different variety.
The Land Before Time.
Yeah.
Land Before Time was one of your absolute favorites. That and Jungle Book. You love Jungle Book. Land Before Time. I have a hard time remembering your name. Littlefoot, of course, in particular. But, you were very interested in his outcome. You wanted him to be okay. Because he got separated. If I remember correctly, he was separated from his family when the earth shook. That's what they called it, right? Didn't they call it an earth shake?
Whoa! What's that? It's a
The Land Before Time, which came out in 1988, is about a long-necked dinosaur named Littlefoot and his motley band of prehistoric buddies navigating a hostile world that has literally been rent apart by a massive earthquake. Early on in the movie, as the world is splitting in half, Littlefoot's mom gets mortally wounded by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. But before she dies, she leaves her son with some parting words about an Edenic valley where he can be reunited with his surviving family.
I'll be with you, even if you can't see me.
What do you mean if I can't see you? I can always see you.
Littlefoot, let your heart guide you. It whispers, so listen closely.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, this kind of scene is pretty emotionally devastating for a child. As my mom tells it, movies about kids being separated from their parents, kind of Disney Pixar's bread and butter, always brought me to tears.
You always, in movies, you were always concerned about a young character not having their mom, like visual to you, that if their mom wasn't right there, it was always, where's his mom? And yes, with Littlefoot, it was like, yes, where's his mom? And it's a heartbreaking thing, really, for your child to say that, because, a lot of those stories were about, children overcoming not having their parent with them, or a parent that has, passed away. Yeah. But you were always concerned about. I think I mentioned to you that you would look at a photo of yourself, like if we took a picture at the park or the zoo, and you would be by yourself in the photo. You always would say, "Where's his mommy?" And I would always say, "I'm the mommy." So you didn't really recognize that was you in the photo.
I'm not talking about these two dinosaur movies with my mom purely to reminisce about my childhood, though I do enjoy doing that. There's a reason they're on my mind, and it all goes back to Dick Badenhop's journal entry that I read you earlier, the one about the unnamed patient and her relationship with the movie The Way We Were, and the problem she had with Dick using the verb crying to describe what happens to her in the theater. For what it's worth, I plan to talk more about Dick and his wife Eileen and their private therapy practice in future episodes. But for now, I want to stay focused on this specific entry. Because, depending on who you ask, crying isn't always the most accurate term to describe the emotional discharge of tears. In fact, in his 1964 book The Act of Creation, the Austro-Hungarian writer Arthur Koestler made that very argument. In a chapter called The Logic of the Moist Eye, Koestler drew a distinct line between the acts of crying and weeping. Crying, he argues, is a form of communication. It involves emitting sounds to signal some type of distress or protest to an audience, real or imagined. Consider 3-year-old me in a screening of Jurassic Park. Terrified by the sight of bloodthirsty dinosaurs, I cry out to signal to my mom that I want to be whisked away from the danger on screen. Which is perhaps all to say that there's some weight behind the argument that crying is what babies do. However, Koestler defined the act of weeping as something far more complex. He insisted that weeping could be broken down into 4 stages. Stage 1 produced a lump in the throat. Stage 2 included watery eyes. Stage 3 was defined by the flowing of tears, and Stage 4 indicated convulsive sobbing. As to the reasons why we weep, Koestler offered 5 main scenarios. The first was raptness, listening to an organ in a cathedral, looking at a majestic landscape from atop a mountain, being in love. Any of these experiences could lead to the moistening of eyes and the overflow of tears. The second reason someone might weep, and perhaps this one is a bit more obvious, is in the act of mourning, overwhelmed by a sense of loss, a surrender to grief. These were the experiences of profound sadness that, to quote Cotton from King of the Hill, might cause your pain water to seep up. The third reason we weep is out of a feeling of relief. The example Koestler provides asks you to imagine a woman whose son has been reported missing during a war. One day, this woman, this hypothetical mother, gets a call to report to the War Office immediately. When she arrives, she sees her son enter the room. Not only is he no longer missing, he is alive and well. So flooded is she by the feeling of relief that she flings her arms around him and weeps uncontrollably. The fourth scenario Koestler provides is weeping out of sympathy. In this case, one person participates in the existence of another, and in doing so, vicariously experiences all the feelings of the other person. To return to the example about relief, consider that when one mother is reuniting with her long-lost son in the War Office, there is also another mother standing off to the side, waiting in the lobby. She witnesses the blessing of reunification and is also overcome by weeping. Or, if that example seems too abstract, consider a toddler sitting in front of the television watching his VHS copy of The Land Before Time. When the young dinosaur named Littlefoot experiences the death of his mother, the toddler in front of the TV can't help but imagine how such a loss would feel, so he is moved to a state of quiet, trembling tears. The fifth and final scenario Koestler describes is one of self-pity. He argues that when we have exhausted our well of frustration and rage, and when we have accepted defeat, weeping is both an expression of our helplessness and a yearning for consolation. I don't necessarily subscribe to Koestler's theory about the difference between crying and weeping, but it does offer an interesting framework for thinking about my own experience, fervidly crying to escape the dangers of Jurassic Park versus sympathetically weeping for the orphan dinosaur called Littlefoot. Plus, I know that this concern with semantics was also on Dick's mind. He never references Koestler, either in his journals or in the other paperwork I got a hold of, but it's easy enough to see that the search for the right word is something that matters to him, not just in the excerpt that I shared with you, but in the thousands of sessions he had with different patients over the course of his career. Before I end this episode, I want to return to that original journal excerpt, because I didn't actually read all of it, and it's only by hearing the whole thing that you can really begin to understand why Dick and Eileen devoted so much of their lives to the study of crying. Here it is again, in full this time.
Our conversations now revolve exclusively around the way we were. She does not want to talk about him or the war or tangible loss. Rather, she prefers to spend her time in the cinema, if not in the theater itself, then in the moving image of memory, which has itself become inseparable from the fictions on screen. She says that each time she sees it in the theater, her crying fits arrive earlier and earlier. However, she takes issue with my use of the term crying. Crying is for babies, she says. I asked her which word she preferred I use, and she stared thoughtfully at the ceiling for what felt like a long while, as if she might find the word floating above her. I waited for her to respond, and the longer she remained silent, the more I found that I was okay with it. Her attention turned elsewhere, and so did mine, to the past mainly, where it is often called. Each of us lost there in the reverie of our private griefs. I don't even remember falling asleep, but Eileen came to wake me, and when she did, the light in my office was a rich orange. She asked me what I'd been dreaming about, but I couldn't remember. She used her fingers to wipe the space beneath my eyes, and it became evident that I had yet again been crying in my sleep. I don't know why. I never do. What happens there is a mystery to me. Perhaps crying is the wrong word, though I'm not certain a right one exists.
Join me next time on part 2 of A Brief History of Crying at the Movies to learn more about who Dick Badenhop and Eileen Fletcher were, and how they ended up crossing paths. This has been a production of Wildborough Studio. Thanks for joining me for another episode of I'm Not Crying. Until next time.